Let me just say, first of all, thank you, Katerina and Rich, for inviting me to speak to the Church of the Holy City in DC. I'm honored to be with you. Good evening to everyone. Katerina told my whole story. Basically, I'm going to just fill in some small blanks of my personal life because I live in South Carolina now, and you're probably wondering how I got here or why I moved back south, right? My first husband passed away, and after several years, or about 8 years really, I reconnected with an old boyfriend. And I had met him when I lived in New York, for almost 40 years before that. And he lived in South Carolina. So I sold my house and moved down here. And that's why I'm in South Carolina now. But back to, I retired from a career of 41 years as a broadcast journalist in 2014. And you'd think I would take a break because that was a lot of work for a long time. But no, I had to write a book. And the reason I wrote Daughter of the Boycott, a couple of things. One is that my father was writing his own narrative about Daughter of the Boycott. And he passed away 2011. He had cancer and died. And it was as if he had just thrown down the mantle and I had to pick it up. He handed the torch to me and I had to write it. And I wanted to say thank you to him and to my uncle, Fred Gray, the renowned civil rights attorney, for really, and not just the two of them, but to a whole community of people, unsung foot soldiers who put their lives at risk in a fight for racial justice. So I'm going to use some pictures to help tell you a few of the stories that I have to share. And well, as I was saying, I've spent a lot of years as a reporter. And so reporters like to put the lead first. When we tell you a story, we want to lead with the newest, most important information. So just a week ago, I was in DC at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery for a celebration of my Uncle Fred. And I'll tell you right here, right now, that I have called him Uncle Teddy for as long as I could speak. And so I might lapse into that today. So if I say Uncle Teddy instead of Fred Gray, that's who I'm talking about. He's standing beside this beautiful portrait that was painted by the artist here, and he looks like an artist, doesn't he? Michael Shane Neal. And so we were celebrating my uncle's amazing legal career and the fact that this portrait has been added to the Portrait Gallery's permanent collection. All right. All right. So that was the first picture was a week ago. This was July 2022. President Biden awarded my uncle the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor that you can obtain. That same year in November, my dad, here's the late Judge Thomas Gray, was inducted into his law school's Hall of Fame. And that's me and my younger brother, Thomas Jr., at Cleveland State University Law School accepting the award on my dad's behalf. And I really wish he could have been there to accept it for himself. 2021, sometimes these years they're like running together for me, but I believe that was 2021. The street that my uncle and my father and their siblings grew up on in Montgomery was named West Jeff Davis Avenue after a Confederate president. And so the city of Montgomery has changed the name of that street, and it is now Fred D. Gray Avenue. So we're excited about that. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Claudette Colvin. Show of hands? We're going to talk about her later, but she, that same day of the street renaming, petitioned a court in Montgomery to have her juvenile record expunged, and that was a successful thing. This woman was a young girl when she refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, and that happened 9 months before the incident with Rosa Parks. So that was the new news. This is the old news. I was 4 years old when the boycott started, and those are my two younger brothers. We were really, Thomas and Frederick, we were too young to really know what was going on with the boycott. Our parents wove a little cocoon around us, didn't tell us what was going on. But I do have a very vivid recollection of something that happened uh, at the end of the boycott, right after it was over. My mom dressed us up one day and she told her, and that's my mom, Juanita Emanuel Gray. She has also passed away, but and this picture was taken when she was a student at Alabama State Teachers College for Negroes. It's got a new name now, but she told us she was going to take us on this bus ride, and she marched us about half a block down the street to a bus stop. And when the bus came, we got on the bus, and she said, we sat right behind the white bus driver. She said, I want you little Negro children to know what it's like not to have to ride in the back. And so you probably take integration for granted right now, but back then in the South, in Alabama and all over the Deep South, we lived segregation firsthand. Black people could not attend white schools, go to white restaurants or hotels, or use white restrooms, and they even had water fountains set aside for white people. So, it was a terrible time. And if I can give you just a hint of what it was like, paint a picture, if we got on a bus, you had to, and I didn't because I was a kid and we didn't ride the buses, but Black people would get on a bus, put their little dime in the fare box, and the bus drivers had police powers. And if they wanted to, they could tell you to get off the bus, go around to the side and get on in the back, because the first 10 seats in the front were reserved for white people anyway. So it was a terrible time to be a Black person in the South. But my father and my uncle had a big role in changing all of that. And so, we're pretty thrilled about it. But 5 years before, if I can say that there was an incident that helps set the stage. I mean, Black people were already angry, but then Hilliard Brooks, this man right here, was a Black man who was trying to get a ride on a bus in downtown Montgomery, was shot and killed by a white police officer. The circumstances are a little fuzzy. Nothing is ever perfect, and almost everyone agrees that he was drunk and disorderly at the time. A Justice Department report later said that the police officer who was called over to handle the situation got on the bus, took a club, hit Hilliard, and when he was trying to get off the bus, he was shot. But there were eyewitnesses who take issue with that and say that what happened outside the bus, that the Hilliard had gotten off the bus, and when the officer arrived, he pushed Hilliard to the ground, and when Hilliard got back up, he got shot by the officer, and he died later at the hospital, leaving his wife, who was pregnant, and a child to mourn his death. My dad was a friend of Hilliard Brooks. They used to play street football together as kids, and they both joined the Navy when World War II broke out. And when my father found out that this guy had been killed, he flew into a rage and said, we got to do something. He petitioned the city officials to, prosecute the police officer to the fullest extent of the law, and what happened? Nothing. So Dad and some of his fellow friends at an AMVET post that was training veterans staged a huge veterans protest in downtown Montgomery. And they didn't want to be charged with loitering, so they marched down Dexter Avenue and they went to a courthouse, and they got people to register to vote at a time when a lot of Black people were not registered. But what happened, not really anything came out of that much, but I think there was an article in the newspaper the next day that said that for some strange reason, and they quoted a clerk in the court, a lot of Black people registered to vote. They called us Negroes then. A lot of Negroes registered to vote. Now back to Claudette Colvin. Claudette was 15 years old. She had a class in school. It was right after, it was March of 1955, had a class in Black History Month class, and talked to a teacher, was telling them about how terrible things were and the injustices. And it was near, what was it, Easter, and Claudette wanted to buy some pretty little patent leather shoes, but she knew she was going to have to draw an outline of her foot on a brown paper bag so she could get her shoes. And she was just thinking about all these terrible things when the police came and took her, dragged her off the bus, and she was refusing to get up and saying, I have a constitutional right to be on this bus. I paid my fare. I'm sitting in the colored floor section of the bus. I shouldn't have to get up. She was charged with disorderly conduct and assault against a police officer. And it was not a good situation. There could have been, and people were talking about having a boycott, but they didn't have one with Claudette because she got pregnant. And they didn't want that to be the face of their fight against segregation. And so, you know, we got Rosa Parks, who popped up at the right place and the right time. And hello, she was not that demure, quiet little seamstress that she was portrayed as by the media. But Rosa Parks was an activist, and I like to call her a warrior. She despised segregation. She was the secretary for the NAACP. She was she headed up their youth council. She was always trying to get the kids to go and get books out of the white library downtown and not take no for an answer, even though they told them, go back to your neighborhood and get a book there. We're not going to give you any of our books. And she was an investigator. She was sent down to Abbeville, Alabama, to investigate a rape against a young Black woman who was gang raped by 6 white men. Anyway, she was not that quiet little tired lady on the bus that people thought about. She started having lunch with my uncle. Fred Gray was just out of law school. He had gone up to Cleveland, Ohio, and gone to Western Reserve, came back, and he was on a mission to, you know, get some cases that would help him get rid of segregation. So he and Rosa Parks started having lunch and trying to figure out what they were going to do, how she would behave if the circumstances presented themselves on a bus. And she had already had a bad experience with somebody. So when my dad and uncle found out she had been arrested, they got to work on the boycott. There were 40,000 people, Black people, living in Montgomery at the time. And for the most part, for that entire 382 days of the boycott, almost none of them rode the buses. Well, they needed help getting to work. And so the organization that was set up, the Montgomery Improvement Association, and my dad was on the board, put together this massive carpool arrangement. And people drove their personal cars and picked up passengers to keep them off the buses. When money started coming in, they bought station wagons, they used funeral cars. It was just kind of an amazing thing. And Dad drove his own car to pick up passengers so they wouldn't ride the buses. And Martin Luther King did that too. Martin Luther King was driving his car so people wouldn't take the bus. Thomas Gray was a businessman. He and one of our neighbors and his college buddy, William Singleton, owned this store, Dozier's. It's a radio, TV, and appliance store. And my dad, years after this episode was all over, liked to brag about the fact that he sold TV sets and washing machines to Reverend King and Coretta when they moved into town. And Dad had a side gig. It's kind of connected to the boycott, because when Negroes would get up in the morning, they'd turn on their radios and they wanted to find out where they could go, because there were these mass meetings going on at churches around town. Which one of them was going to be having a mass meeting so they could find out what Reverend King and Abernathy were saying about, you know, what was happening with the boycott. And then my uncle, kid out of law school, became the boycott attorney. He filed cases with Rosa Parks. Hers was a disorderly conduct case for being on the bus. He filed a couple of cases with Martin Luther King, and he filed a case involving Claudette Colvin that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And that case ended over a year later, in 1956, December 1956. It basically upheld a lower federal court ruling that said that segregated busing was unconstitutional. Over the years, my dad used to brag about his role in the boycott. And once he took our family down to, I think it was the sheriff's office downtown Montgomery so that we could look at the mugshot pictures, the mugshots and arrest records of the 89 people who were arrested during the boycott. And my dad was one of them, and he wore that arrest like a badge of honor for the rest of his life. Segregation did not stop at the Mason-Dixon line. And so after the boycott was over, my dad moved our family to Ohio so he could go to law school because they knew the importance of the law in getting some results. And, so we were like displaced refugees, right? Dad can't go to school, so he's got to go out of town. But what he found was there was enough work for him to do with housing segregation and discrimination. And so he had a remarkable career fighting for civil rights in Ohio, fair housing, anti-poverty law, and he was very successful. The plan was for him to go back to Alabama and work with my uncle to help desegregate everything that needed desegregating in the state of Alabama. But somehow he was unable to pass the bar in Montgomery, in Alabama. No problems. He passed the bar in Ohio, couldn't pass it. And we like to say it was because Alabama wasn't ready for 2 Black graves. But my dad's activism was rewarded over time. This picture was taken during the 60th anniversary of the boycott in Montgomery, and it's hanging on the wall in the administration offices at Alabama State University, his alma mater. For reasons I cannot tell you, my mom and dad decided they wanted to move back to Alabama after all those years in Cleveland. And what was helpful was that my father got a federal appointment as an administrative law judge in the state of Alabama that would not admit him to go to law school in the 50s and 60s. My parents stayed in touch with Rosa Parks over the years. She passed away, as you know, 2005, and then Dad died in 2011. But my Uncle Fred is 94. He had his birthday in December, so he's still out there talking about the importance of what happened in Montgomery and being recognized for it. He's accepting honorary doctorate degrees and all those other things I told you about earlier. And he had to do the same thing, go up north, leave the state of Alabama to go to law school. And he was a man on a mission. He hated what was happening on the buses, and at Alabama State, he had to take the buses to get to college. So when he went to law school, he said he was going to go back to Alabama, get a law degree, and destroy everything segregated he could find. And that's what he did. He filed lawsuits that eliminated discrimination in transportation and schools and juries and restaurants and housing, and how about this? There's a historical marker in honor of him on the biggest street, the most important street in downtown Montgomery, Dexter Avenue, which is down the street from the State House and the Alabama legislature. Dexter Avenue Baptist Church is on this street, and right where this marker is, he used to have a law office, but now it's the home for the Alabama State Supreme Court. When I think about all the things my folks did, I think about something that Barack Obama once said, and that is that ordinary people in local communities can do extraordinary things. And my dad was such a fan. He loved Barack Obama so much that he bought his book, The Audacity of Hope, and one Christmas he gave it to all of his friends. And he just said he never thought that he would see the day in his life that a Black man would be president of the United States. And these are the Gray siblings, some ordinary people who did some extraordinary things, though they might take issue with me for calling them ordinary. Ironically, they came from really humble beginnings. This is the street they used to live on, that West Jeff Davis that I told you about. The house they lived in had no hot and cold running water. They used to read from kerosene lamps. This is a little store that kind of like a little convenience store for the neighborhood that my dad got for my grandmother, Nancy Gray Arms. That's her. And this is Uncle Teddy right here after he got out of the Navy. Fred Gray is not still practicing law. I need to get rid of that slide. He still goes to the law office every day, though. His sons are in the practice. He's working now on his continuing his legacy and working on continuing the legacy of the museum he established, the Tuskegee History Museum, which was founded as a permanent memorial for the Tuskegee syphilis experiment victims. And he was able to reach a settlement in their case. And so that museum has become more than just a permanent memorial. It is now a museum that documents the history of all of the surrounding community of Tuskegee and Macon County. So when I was doing research on the book, I went back to Montgomery in 2015. I think that was the 60th anniversary of the boycott. And I rounded up a bunch of my old friends and neighbors. And that little house we're standing in front of is the house we lived in when I was a little girl. And I just wanted to have some sort of sense from them of what life was like and how it had changed in Montgomery. I joined a civic group or two. One of them, called One Montgomery, meets weekly. They bring in lawmakers and politicians and newsmakers just to discuss things. And their feeling is, if you could just sit people of color down with some white people over a meal and talk about things, maybe we could curtail some of the racial problems that we're having. Well, at one of the early meetings, I told them that I was writing a book about the Montgomery bus boycott. Did anybody know anything? Did they have people they could steer me in the direction of? Blah, blah, blah. And this lady was sitting at my table, Sally Mosier, and she leaned over and said, "You're going to want to talk to me." My father was Clyde Sellers. Clyde Sellers was the racist police commissioner during the boycott who did everything he could to block integration from happening. So she agreed to do an interview. I interviewed everybody on camera and she agreed to do it. She told me some very interesting things, revealing things about her dad, including that she said he was a racist. She later called me up and said maybe she was too harsh. She was a product of his time. I talked to Vera Harris and her daughter Valda. They lived 3 houses down from the parsonage where Dr. King and Coretta lived. And when somebody threw a firebomb on the King's porch, their house shook and the windows shattered as well. I spoke to Ann Carmichael. She's a well-to-do white woman who had a black maid during the boycott. And they had to figure out how to get the black maid to work without riding the buses. I went to see the maid. Her name, she's still alive too. Ann Carmichael has since passed away. The maid told me that her feet still hurt from all that walking they had to do during the boycott. Intrepid reporter that I am, I know this. If you want to find out something about what's going on in a town, you go talk to people in a barbershop. So I went to the Malden Brothers barbershop and I spoke to Nelson Malden, who was Martin Luther King's barber. Told me some real funny stories about Dr. King that really kind of personalize him. One thing I discovered, and some people might be a little surprised about, there were white allies during that boycott. Reverend Ray Watley was a Methodist minister who was basically driven out of town and out of his church because he was preaching against the evils of segregation from the pulpit. And then you have the Gratzes, Reverend Bob and Jeannie Gratz. I love them. They have passed away. I felt some urgency in writing this book because I knew a lot of the people were going to be gone. And Reverend Watley, I think, died at 100. He was 100 years old. The Gratzes were lifelong friends of my parents. They died, I think it was last year. They pastored an all-Black Lutheran church, and they were really active in the boycott. He drove his car and picked up Black passengers to keep them off the buses. He told the people in his church not to go to not to participate don't get on the buses, basically. He had a lot of kids and they used to come and visit us. So it was at a time when, integration was really dangerous, but the kids used to come to our house and Bob and Jeannie were really good buddies with my parents. They met during the boycott and they would play pinochle and bridge and they drank a little wine. So it's just glad to know them, and we're still I'm still friends with their kids. Uh, we can probably, am I going over? Should we stop this? Or I can continue. I know I was looking at the time and going, Katrina told
Maybe,
me I can't
maybe
talk
another,
all day.
maybe another minute or two, and then we
Okay.
can open it up to questions.
I went to see Claudette Colvin at her house in the Bronx, but she has since moved away to be closer to relatives. But she was finally starting to get some respect for what she has done. A mention in the congressional record, they named a street after her, and I'm happy to see that she has had her juvenile record expunged. So, now you can, Black people, my friends and relatives can get on a bus and we don't think twice about where we can sit on a bus. And there I was that was 2015 during the 60th anniversary, and they had those 1950s era replicas, and I took a ride on it, and I thought it just gave me goosebumps to think about what my parents had done, my family members, to leave us in a situation where we don't have to think about who can ride on a bus or go to a restaurant, or though we do have a problem with the resegregation of public schools after a long fights to get them on there. This could be a good spot to stop and just take some questions. Let me get out of here. Let's see.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. That was an incredible family legacy. And it struck me as you were talking that you're bringing your beautiful skills as a journalist, the way you tell the story and very concise but very detailed. And you brought all these people to life. A lot of them would have been overlooked or not remembered, and you brought them all up. And I know that when I've read the civil rights history, or I'm sure it's true in most cases, but I remember reading some civil rights histories where people said, everybody gave Dr. King all the credit, but we in this community, we did this, this, and this, and this, and nobody ever, we're not in any books. We didn't get any, so it's very common in history to pick a person or a two and then make them iconic, but it doesn't show like all the community organizers and all the people who did the quiet little things and of course the woman who was arrested before um, for taking the seat and stuff like that. I just really appreciate you bringing voice to all these people in such an articulate way and acknowledging that it took so many different people doing so many different things from legal to driving to pastoring. It's not just like a person. And I think we get wrapped up in like the leader is going to save us. I really appreciated that part.
I knew, Rich, that there were many people who had to have been involved. And so when I retired, I said, let me go and find out who some of those people were. Because if I don't tell this story, who's going to tell it? Maybe nobody. And church and community were really critical from the very beginning in the boycott. Uh, when Rosa Parks was arrested. She went to trial, and there was the people who were deciding that there should be a boycott. My uncle, a woman, Joanne Robinson was the Women's Political Council leader, and E.D. Nixon was the NAACP president. They'd all been thinking about boycotts. They looked at other cities where there had actually been boycotts, small boycotts that didn't get much attention in Mobile and Baton Rouge. And so the Women's Political Council mimeographed flyers saying, we're going to have the boycott on the Monday following that Sunday. And what did they do on Sunday? They took the flyers to churches because they knew that's where they could reach people. And the mass meetings were all at churches because people went to church then. And it was it was a gathering place. It was kind of like a pep rally to keep people, pepped and revved up and ready to not get on the buses, and also to raise money because they needed money to buy station wagons, other cars, to do things that would support their efforts. And so churches played a major role. And here's another thing that was important, and I guess often gets mentioned, though, that Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolent civil disobedience and how critical that was in helping give Black people the moral high ground. And I'm convinced that that's what even the Supreme Court probably looked down and saw, gosh, it lasted so long and it was nonviolent, mostly on the part of the Black people. You know, and there were threats, bombings, and, um, uh, vandalism directed at them. That just it just pointed out the unfairness and how all they want is a way to get on a bus and not have to sit in the back and be humiliated.
Beautiful. I want to acknowledge in the chat that Jimmy Cox, who is our church building manager for and wedding coordinator for 30 years, is from Alabama himself, and he writes, "As a Black man, every time I get on the bus, I think about the boycott." I don't know if you want to say anything more about it, Jimmy, but I wanted to make sure that that was shared, that what it impacts those events can have in people's lives.
Well, I
Think
just
about
want
it.
to say
Oh,
that this story resonates with me. And, it's a part of my everyday life. You're not telling me anything that my grandmother, Maggie B. Ragland, who lived in Anniston, Alabama, told me this story over and over as a child. She was a housekeeper on the east side of town. That's where most of the Caucasians lived. And her husband, Coleman Ragland, would drive her to work all during the boycott. I've heard this story all my life, how that he would take her to work. We were fortunate enough to have a car, and he would pick up other people walking along the way.
can you imagine getting that kind of support to a cause? If I were to take a survey of this room right now, three of us could not agree on a place to go for dinner.
But the thing about that, it just didn't happen in Montgomery. As the word spread, housekeepers all over Alabama didn't ride the bus in support of the boycott. I don't know if you're aware of that.
I didn't really think beyond Montgomery, but thanks for pointing that out. And it makes sense.
Yeah, it was not just a Montgomery thing. I know this for a child. I lived this story. It was an Alabama thing. Housekeepers from around Alabama refused to ride the bus in support of the boycott. So it was a universal Alabama thing.
Well, it almost drove the Alabama City Lines bus company out of business. And, which is what
Well,
the
in 1970, it drove the Anniston system out of business. There had been such a low ridership during the 60s. When 1970 came about, they took away the public bus system in Anniston. I don't know if you know anything about Anniston, Alabama, but read your history. That's the city where the Freedom Riders came through. And I lived in a house on the street that the Freedom Riders came through. My mother told me a story of a cross being burnt in our yard. She was a little girl. They were looking out the window, and they came and burned a cross in their yard. My grandfather told them to get back, but they all peeped out the window and they saw the cross burn. So I live this story. I'm very passionate about this story. You're not telling me anything that I don't know. I come to tears just hearing this story because it was a part of my everyday life as a child.
There were a lot of hateful things going on that happened to a lot of people. And
Yeah.
I sympathize. And, I'm glad I wrote my part down. You still have time.
I don't, is it a public story or is it just my story? I'm not sure.
Well, I kind of felt like it's a story that needed to be told because everybody just knew that little part. And you know what? America didn't really recognize the bus boycott much as anything but a news story for many years as a history story. It took 30 to 40 years before anybody started writing really history books about it. Martin Luther King wrote a book 2 years after the boycott called Stride Toward Freedom. And then the next big books like Parting the Waters and Bearing the Cross didn't happen for 30 years after the fact. And those were written by white people. And so then Rosa Parks wrote her story. She called it My Story, but that wasn't until 1990 something. And Joanne Robinson, who was the woman from the Women's Political Council, her book came in the 1990s. My uncle wrote a book, 1990s. So when I was going to school, I wasn't hearing any of those stories because people hadn't written much about the history.
I think that's an inspiration for maybe Jimmy. There might be a book that Church of the Holy City will work with you on to produce to tell your story because these stories need to get out. And Karen's done such a great job of walking us through this. I wanted to see if there was any questions from anybody in the group. I have one, but I wanted to see if anybody else had one before I go.
Karen, did your uncle or father cross paths with John Lewis?
Yes. And it's really funny. When I was reporting in DC and I would run into John Lewis on Capitol Hill, he'd say, you know, your uncle was the first lawyer I ever met. And so how he met him was he was trying to integrate a college, and he wanted to talk to Dr. Martin Luther King. He'd heard King on the radio, something like that. And so he had written to King and wanted to come and see him. And King told he was going to, I think they sent him a bus ticket from wherever he was, and he took the bus. And my uncle met him at the bus station and took him to the church to meet Dr. King for the first time. So yes, they have had a long history and connection together. And my uncle went to see him, or at least talk to him in his waning days. And he basically, Lewis basically told my uncle, you know, keep the faith and keep on going.
Before your lecture, or before your sermon today, his book, a graphic novel or graphic autobiography, I read that to my late mother-in-law in her last days. And that's where I learned an awful lot about what was happening in the South when I was in a nice suburb of Boston.
I used to work in Boston. Actually, WHDH radio
Right, I watched them.
and United, well, they were radio, TV, and newspaper. There was a lawsuit that disrupted the monopoly at some point, but I just worked for the radio station. And United Press International, I think, was my first job in Boston. I was there for that. And here's the irony. My dad was on the radio during the bus boycott, and I was on the radio during busing desegregation in Boston.
Louisa May Hicks, was that her name?
Louise Day Hicks.
Well,
Yes.
yeah, right.
Mm-hmm. You know how I feel. The people would ask her how she felt about it. And it was like she used coded language to say, I can't stand the Black people either.
Thank you, Karen, for the sermon and for writing the book and sharing your story. Not to give too much of a focus on the names that we already know, but I am curious about the barber stories about Dr. King. If there's anything that you could share, I would love to hear it.
I'm going to tell you to read the book.
Fair enough. Will do.
They're amusing stories, but that just really humanize him. That's all I'm going to say.
Love it. Okay. Thank you.
Very enticing.
Was your family in Cleveland in the 1960s at all?
Yes, that's when we moved there.
My uncle, Sheldon Clark, who was a Swedenborgian, was a lawyer, and he was in the Cuyahoga Court, Domestic Court of Relations. He was a judge in that court, but he was also a civil rights activist. One of my favorite sayings, he says, the folks in East Cleveland count the votes slow, but they count the votes good.
Cleveland was, some of those big cities were, there was racism and, discrimination that was happening up north. It was sometimes a little bit more subtle. I'll tell you one story. When we first moved there, Dad he was sold out his business, his share of the business and our little house in Montgomery, and he needed money for law school. And he and my mom were looking for an apartment just for us to move to. And they were dealing with some realtor, and she took them to the projects. So it's like, we're looking for an apartment to live in. And the first thing that she could think of was to take us to the projects. So, and they drove my dad nuts. It's like, we may be poor, but we're not that poor. And why would you automatically do that?
Well, I think we could go on with many more questions. What a beautiful way that you've told the story and lifted up these voices and honored people who may not have been honored. So I really appreciate that, particularly people who just recently passed and so forth and couldn't tell their story. And I think you've also inspired Jimmy to tell his story, which I want to hear more about too. And I think you've inspired all of us, including Nikki, to get the book and read the stories. So thank you so much for sharing these stories and this important part of our American history. And it was a pivotal moment. And we need to learn from the past as we come into challenging times in our own country at this time and remember the lessons that a few courageous people standing forth can change things. And we shouldn't lose heart when we're in situations where it feels like nothing can change.
I thank you for appreciating the book. I'm going to defer to young people to go out and do something about it, because if you think about it, who were the real activists during most of our protest movements, but starting there, they were people in their 20s. Martin Luther King was what, 26 maybe? My uncle was 23. My dad was 31. Young people who saw things they were offended by and wanted justice and took the time to have planning meetings to do something about it.
There's the charge. There's the charge. Let's see where it goes. There's the charge for us. Thank you.